gardening, but she was also a great Francophile. She loved all things French. And it's really her that I think you have to give the greatest credit towards steering Paul Mellon in the direction of French art. The first French painting to enter the Mellon collection, the collection of Paul Mellon, is this charming little painting, Hanging the Laundry Out to Dry by Berthe Morisot, which he acquired in 1950, 2 years after he married Bunny Mellon. He talks about this also in his memoirs, and he says that I had fallen in love with it at first sight. He happened to stumble upon it. It was in a window of the Rosenberg Gallery in New York. He was visiting various galleries, and he walked by it, and he kept walking by it, and finally he went in, and it was even more beautiful in person, and he knew that he had to have it. It provides a breath of country air, a sense of tranquility, some essence of the French countryside. He wrote about this painting, which clearly was one that he was extraordinarily attached to. And then, of course, he acquired other great Morisots, these two wonderful landscapes. Morisot is not terribly well known as a landscape painter. She's more familiar to most modern visitors as a painter of women and children, of more domestic scenes. Some of you may even get the opportunity, if you're going to Dallas anytime soon. There's a beautiful Berthe Morisot retrospective that is opening at the end of the month at the Dallas Museum of Art. I highly recommend seeing it if you love Morisot. It's the largest exhibition of her art that's been mounted in the United States since 1989. So that's my pitch for someone else's exhibition. I felt that I had to do that. But these paintings are sadly lacking. I have to send photographs of these to the curator just to taunt her, just so say, sorry, you couldn't have these for your exhibition, because they're in Tennessee right now. So her loss is definitely your gain. But the Mellons loved open-air painting. They loved these luminous, impressionist landscapes. That's that breath of country air. I'm showing you two Pizarros. The one on the right is in the current exhibition. The one on the left belongs to the National Gallery. One of the games I often play with myself is sort of matching up what went where, who got which painting. Oftentimes there'll be cognates, pairs of paintings, and you'll sort of see it as this lecture progresses. Two very similar paintings that went in very different directions, and sometimes I regret that they can't be together, and they can't live together and speak to each other on the wall, but I understand the rationale between dividing them so that two different audiences can enjoy these extraordinary paintings. One of the things that I've always found very interesting about the Mellon collection is how many unusual choices the Mellons make. There's lots of people collecting Impressionist paintings in the 1950s and 60s when Paul Mellon is really building his collection. Chesterdale is one of them. And while there are certain similarities, there's some very unique qualities of this collection that distinguish it from all their collections. One thing is this interest in early works by artists, not necessarily the most traditional. I mean, here you have Camille Pissarro, the great Impressionist painter, beautiful landscape paintings. This is, again, classic Impressionism, what you think of when you think of Impressionist paintings. This is sort of textbook Camille Pissarro of peasant paintings, peasants in the landscape. One never thinks of things like these wonderful little Caribbean paintings that are evocations of the island of St. Thomas, where lots of people don't know that Camille Pissarro actually was born in the French Indies and actually came to Paris later on. And these paintings were done after the fact, after he arrived in Paris. They're evocations of that past. But they're not paintings you would necessarily immediately think of as being by Pissarro. And they're extraordinarily rare. There's only about, I think, a total of 10 of these paintings, all told, and Paul Mellon bought 4 of them and gave 2 on the left to Virginia, the 2 on the right to Washington. Ours are much smaller. Virginia got the larger ones. Again, this is a very interesting choice, and it's not the kind of decision most collectors would make. Most collectors either tend to collect one artist in complete depth, or they tend to sort of collect the same kinds of things, the same period, things that all speak to the same moment. And Paul Mellon's interest in early works is very unusual. We see it again in these early still life paintings, the wonderful Gauguin. Again, you know, who would think this is a Paul Gauguin? You know, where's the Tahitian women? Where are the Breton girls dancing? It's so atypical. It's so surprising. In this early Monet, this is actually one of the very first paintings that Monet produced. Again, not a painting that if you brought in any art historian and showed it to him blind and said, name the artist, I guarantee you most art historians would have no idea, and they would guess incorrectly because it's not what you expect. It's something that's completely sort of out of that. And again, Au-delà Redon, these wonderful, weird early landscapes. They're never exhibited. Every time there's a retrospective of Redon, I grab the catalog, and they never talk about these early works. They go right for the flower paintings, right for the symbolist paintings. But Paul Mellon understood and valued, these works. He understood the merit. And part of this may also be due to the fact that one of his advisors was John Rewald, who was a great art historian, sort of the great figure in history of Impressionism and Post-Impressionist painting. And he would on occasion advise the Mellons, but always the final word was with the Mellons. And he knew his own mind, Bunny knew her own mind, and they made their own choices, no matter what they advised. These advisors were very good, I think, bringing interesting things to their attention and letting them know they existed, but the final word was with the Mellons. And again, another unusual quality is Caillebotte. Now, Caillebotte is fairly well known today. His name has become more familiar. National Gallery did a retrospective, actually, just 3 years ago on Caillebotte. But in the 1960s, there were very few works in public collections. Most of the works were still with the heirs. In fact, a good portion of his collection still is with the family. There's 7 family members who all bicker like, they get along, they do not get along. It's very complicated to deal with them. But in the 1960s, no one was acquiring works by Caillebotte. No one even knew the name, and if they did, they knew him because he was an art collector, and he gave a great donation to the Louvre, which is now at the Musée d'Orsay. So these are paintings that really were not on people's radars. And you see that as well with my personal favorite, Frédéric Bazille, an artist I love deeply. And as Megan mentioned, I organized an exhibition in 2016 with the Musée Fabre and the Musée d'Orsay on Bazille. Paul Mellon bought 4 paintings by Bazille in the 1960s. All the more extraordinary because there's only about 60 paintings total by this artist. He died very young. He was killed fighting in the Franco-Prussian War just shy of his 29th birthday. So very tiny body of work. Once again, almost everything was with the family. So there hadn't even been, in the case of both Bazille and Caillebotte, there hadn't even been a retrospective in America. These artists really were off the grid, in the margins, and yet Paul Mellon had the vision to recognize how extraordinary these works are, how important these figures are. And of course, now today, they're the subjects of major retrospectives around the globe. And he sort of got there at a time before everyone else. Now, he did have some specific preferences in artists, and one of them was Paul Cézanne. He was a great admirer of Cézanne. In fact, between 1953 and 1973, he purchased 10 paintings by the artist, 7 of which ultimately went to the National Gallery of Art. I'm showing you 2 that did not come to Washington. The beautiful little portrait of Victor Choquet, now in Virginia, and this wonderful little still life that was given to Yale University Art Gallery. Yale is yet another recipient of the great generosity of the Mellon largesse. Now, when I mentioned that Paul Mellon's comment about small is beautiful, his pleasure with more intimately human-scaled art that you lived with, that did not mean that he did not appreciate work on a grander scale. His first gifts to the National Gallery, in fact, came in 1970 when he donated 2 paintings, the portrait of Anthony Valabregue, a very early painting in the sort of Cousteau style, what's called the ballsy style, because the paint is very heavy and aggressive, and it's very, very physical kind of painting, very rich and deep and dark. And he gave the artist's father. Now, he did not own the artist's father. He bought it for the National Gallery and gave it as a gift in 1970. So it was a great, and it's a huge painting. It's it's almost life-size. It's an enormous painting, the most important early work by Paul Cézanne from the first decade of his career. So it was a major acquisition and a major gift because Paul Mellon rightly recognized that this was an important work and it belonged in a major museum, and he felt Washington was the correct place. But he continued to buy works of all kinds, these beautiful, luminous Provençal landscapes filled with light and color and atmosphere, and also wonderful figure paintings, Harlequin, and the Boy in Red Waistcoat, which is actually one of his very favorite paintings. And he talked in his memoirs about how the art agent that he'd sent to buy it paid way too much, more than he was supposed to. But he said, I couldn't possibly regret it. How could I regret being able to acquire something this wonderful? Even if it cost me a lot more than I anticipated, it was well worth the cost. And then he bought more intimate things, like a wonderful sketchbook by Cézanne, filled with these beautiful, again, very intimate drawings, things that are meant to be experienced one-on-one, very personal kinds of objects. Again, very relatively rare objects. Now, the French artist that he loved the most, which I'm very glad of, is Edgar Degas. And not surprising, of course, Edgar Degas is known for painting ballerinas and for painting racehorses. Those are his two sort of great, the two sort of poles of his art. And of course, Paul Mellon, the great equestrian, loved horses, loved racing. He talks in his memoirs about his early collecting, how he'd been basically afflicted by galloping Anglophilia. Here you see the galloping on full force, these horse racing subjects. Now, as I mentioned, he was a great horseman. He rode the hounds. He raced his own horses. And he also had a stable, so Rokeby Farms, which raised a number of very prominent racehorses that very proud of, including Milreef. This is actually a sculpture that he commissioned at Rokeby Farms. Milreef was a great success in England and won the Epsom Derby. And Sea Hero, 20 years later, won the Kentucky Derby. And this statue was given to the National Museum of Sporting Art in Middleburg, Virginia. And I remember visiting the curator, and she was knee-deep in trying to figure out how do you actually mount this and how do you light it and all these sort of interesting sort of questions you have when you get a great sculpture like this. But this was his passion. He loved horses, he loved racing. And again, I think the exhibition, the works of art themselves speak very eloquently to how he's being driven by his passion. He buys the things he loves, not because they're important, not because they're historically significant, but because they're things that speak to him that he's passionate about. And so he has these wonderful paintings of horses by Théodore Géricault, who was one of the very first French artists to really begin to paint racehorses. Racing was a relatively late addition to France. It sort of just started in the early 19th century, sort of made its way across the channel and took hold. And I won't talk about that because I could talk for hours about that because I know far too much about the history of French horse racing. But also paintings by Delacroix, a very simple portrait of a beautiful horse, very meaningful. And these two wonderful paintings by De Dreux, who was one of the great equestrian painters in France, one showing the mount belonging to Emperor Napoleon III, and the other two horses that are returning from the race course. Looking, I think you can get a sense that it was not a good day at the course. Even the dog looks dejected with hanging his head. Yes, they did not win those races that day, sadly. But again, there's a wonderful sort of comic note to that. But again, very truthful, very sincere paintings. And then, of course, Degas. He just buys all these wonderful works of paintings and drawings of jockeys. This wonderful work that's in the current exhibition, which I remember very fondly. I had it in my exhibition now, more than 20 years ago. Boy, that was a while ago. This wonderful painting from Yale, and also beautiful drawings. I mean, he bought, in depth of things. But his greatest equestrian treasure was the scene from the steeplechase, The Falling Jockey, which was Degas' sort of white whale of a painting that he reworked on at least 3 separate occasions. This is the painting that he could not keep his grubby mitts off of. It's a magnificent ruin of a painting. It's huge. It was exhibited at the Paris Salon, and then he reworked it over and over again. And you can even see, there's a horse back there. This is sort of peeking out. And all these legs, the X-ray for this painting, basically these are spider horses, legs sticking out everywhere. It's a weird, awkward painting. In fact, a very interesting story attached to this. Mary Cassatt wanted to buy this painting for her brother Alexander Cassatt, who was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad and himself a great horseman. And she thought this was a painting he would like, and Degas said, no, I can't possibly, I need to fix it. And that's one of the campaigns, and then he said, no, I can't, I ruined it. He kind of blamed her for ruining it, which she didn't tell him to rework it. But a letter from Mary Cassatt's mother to her son Alexander said, he will never finish it. You will never buy this painting. He says, and I quite believe him, it's the kind of painting that stays in an artist's studio until he dies and will only be appreciated by other artists. And so she was quite correct. He did not sell it to Alexander. It stayed in his studio until he died. And then it was eventually acquired by Gary Melchers, who was an American painter, and then eventually acquired by Paul Mellon for his own collection. And this was really sort of one of the great acquisitions. And it was very meaningful for Paul Mellon, because he also then amassed this group of beautiful studies related to the painting. It was an important work for him. And I still, to this day, cherish the one time I got to visit the Mellon residence. The Mellons were very private. They did not like lots of people who were not their close friends and family visiting. But I got to visit one time when we were doing Degas at the Races, and myself and our chief curator and our guest curator were able to visit the brick house. And this is the magnificent Oak Spring Farm, their beautiful, magnificent estate in Upperville. And the brick house, which makes it sound cute and quaint, it's an enormous house. I mean, it's magnificent, it's many levels. But that was where Bunny's library was, and it had a beautiful, beautiful window, panoramic window looking out over the grounds. And then that's where the art was stored, and on the, all the sporting art. And on the top floor was the Degas shrine. And this painting hung on one wall with the drawings beside it and the sculptures all around it. And it was just the most, on these green velvet walls. It was designed by Bunny. It was just this beautiful, amazing private museum. And it's one, I always think of it as the Degas shrine, because it really felt like that. I mean, but these were the works he cherished. These were the works that he loved tremendously. But he didn't limit himself to horses. He bought wonderful portraits by Degas. I mean, everything that Degas touched was of interest to the Mellons. Wonderful genre pictures, scene of a milliner's scene, a woman ironing, these scenes of women's labor, and of course the ballet pictures, which this is where I actually do my plug for my exhibition. So please come to Washington in March or spring of 2020 to see Degas at the Opera. Two magnificent works from the Mellon collection, two of many given by them. But the greatest legacy for Degas in the Mellon collection are the waxes. Now, the waxes have a very interesting story. Degas only exhibited one sculpture during his lifetime, the Little Dancer, aged 14. We have the original wax, but there is a version, one of the posthumous casts in the current exhibition. He did quite a bit of sculpture, but it was not something he did for exhibition. It was not something he shared with people. And so after he died, Durand Ruel, his dealer, who was one of the people overseeing the estate, said there were some 150 sculptures, just higgledy-piggledy, many of them in ruins, many of them in pieces. They were falling apart. He hadn't cared for them. And 78 of them were in sufficient state that they could be cast in bronze, and the family gave their permission to cast them. So there were actually these sets of sculptures. The Little Dancer was a separate casting. And it was assumed that the wax sculptures had been destroyed in the process of the casting. That's the normal practice, something that's called the lost wax process, in fact. And then in 1955, there was a miracle. The Abraud foundry discovered that they had the waxes. They still existed. They had survived because they had actually cast intermediary bronze sculptures called Bodel. And the waxes had survived. They didn't return them to the family, which I think personally might be a little hinky. But I don't know what, I confess I do not know what arrangement they had with the family. So they were sold to the Knoedler Gallery in New York. And Paul Mellon visited with his wife, Bunny, and they saw the sculptures and they were just blown away. And they came back and he said, I have to do it. He bought all of them. He bought the whole set in toto. He didn't want them going up piecemeal. He knew they couldn't just sort of go out to people who didn't care and didn't love them. But then he didn't keep them all together. In fact, this is where that philanthropic spirit really comes into play. He shared them. He gave 4 of them to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. There are actually 4 sculptures, bronze sculptures in the current exhibition. The waxes are incredibly fragile, so they do not travel. In fact, Mr. Mellon explicitly stated in his will that they could only be lent between our 2 institutions. So when we did Degatha races, Richmond was able to lend those paintings, but with great care and with conservators basically hovering the whole way and sort of watching them carefully. So they do not travel. So to see them, you would have to go to Virginia. Then he gave 3 to Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, because remember, he studied at Cambridge University, at Clare College, in fact. So he gave 3 of them in honor of their director, Michael Jaffe. He gave 1 to Yale University Art Gallery. He gave 5 to the Musée d'Orsay. I apologize, you do not actually have photographs because the Musée d'Orsay doesn't see fit to actually put decent photographs of the sculptures on their website. So all I have are these not terribly great photographs that I took during a visit not long ago, but you know, it's nice to see them. One day maybe they'll actually photograph them and make them available. And then the remaining sculptures all went to the National Gallery. We have 48 waxes in total, and these are actually my bad photos, but you can get good photographs on our website, so I feel okay with that. But I wanted to give you a sense of how these things are arranged, how they live. I mean, these are extraordinary objects. They are so rare, so unique. And again, Paul Mellon talks about Degas' hands touched these. Degas molded these. He created these. And that personal touch, that connection, was very powerful and very meaningful for him. And so he wanted to be the one to be able to make sure these works found their way to the right people. Now, I wanted to go back and sort of swing around one last time to Bunny Mellon. I don't think Bunny necessarily gets quite the recognition for her role, in part because she was very private, particularly in her later years like Elsa. She was not a very public figure. She loved spending time in her gardens rather than in the public eye. And she was very modest in nature, partly because that was how women were supposed to be at that time. So she didn't really talk about it. And this is sort of something I've noticed in my own research, that oftentimes these great power couples, the man sort of is the one everyone talks about and gives all the attention to because he's the one who, you know, paid the bills. But oftentimes there's his wife, who is also a partner in this and is guiding this. And Paul Mellon was actually very frank about this, that, you know, she was the one who introduced him to French art. She was the one who really sort of inspired a lot of his taste. And in fact, he talked about they would always go look at art together. So it was very much a partnership, the 2 working together. And he said that, you know, sometimes she would be on her own, maybe in Paris, and she would see something, she'd call, and she'd say, I saw something, I think we should acquire it for our collection. And he would always give her the go-ahead. He never asked to see it himself. And he said, I have never been casual when making decisions about buying pictures, but I suppose my complacence was just a mark of absolute confidence in her taste. So she really was, and it's unfortunate because it's very hard to sort of figure out where his personal taste ends and hers begins. Some things like the Cézanne, I feel very confident that really was his personal taste. But more and more I've been thinking about where Bunny fits in this story, what role she played. Because he was very candid. The credit line for all these gifts says Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. She is acknowledged. So I've been thinking more about where does she sort of fit in its legacy. One place, I think, is obviously in paintings that are about gardens, that are about the thing that she was most passionate about. And looking at this wonderful painting by Morisot of a young woman watering a shrub, a woman taking care of plants, something that, you know, she herself did on a regular basis. This wonderful painting of Camille Monet at the window at Argenteuil, surrounded by the sort of explosion of flowers. Now, Claude Monet was the great gardener in that relationship, but here you see her framed in flowers. I mean, she's very much, it's part of her world, the way he sort of encapsulated her and sort of surrounded her by these beautiful growing things. And of course, beautiful scenes of gardens and the poppy fields in Giverny, for example, or a painting of the artist garden in Giverny that he gave to the Yale University Art Gallery. And these wonderful Van Goghs, which I think Van Gogh is one of those artists that she preferred. And you can sort of see this is one of those wonderful places, interesting to sort of compare what Richmond got versus what Washington got. This wonderful sort of dialogue between these two paintings. Fun fact, which I always like to share, the green wheat fields at Auvers, as well as these two still lives. So these were all paintings that remained with Bunny until she passed on. I should say that in Paul Mellin's will, the works were essentially divided. He decided, presumably in close contact with Bunny, how the collection would be divided, but she retained life interest. So even after he died in 1999, the work stayed with her, and she decided when works would be released. And so some works were released during her lifetime, others came to the National Gallery after her death. The Green Wheat Fields, for example, came to us in advance of her death, whereas the still life with blue gloves, like the daisies, came to Virginia after her death. All three of those paintings came to us without frames. Now imagine this. You have a Van Gogh painting, and it's just lying around without a frame. Because these were the things she lived with. These were things she cherished. I mean, I was stunned when I asked the curator, I said, we got both our Van Goghs with no frames. And oh yeah, our Van Gogh came with no frame either, which I never encountered anything quite like that, because usually you frame things and you enshrine them and you treat them as these precious objects. And she didn't. I mean, literally, the Green Wheat Fields apparently just sort of sat on the mantle, just leaning there, which, as a curator, just makes my heart tremble to even consider what could happen if someone jostled it. But it's just one of those sort of quirks about these works of art that they lived with. And I think that's very important, again, to think about living with art. These were things they lived with. And there aren't a lot of photographs, sadly, of the residences. As I said, I never actually got to step foot in the main residence at Upperville. That was something that really only friends and family were allowed to do. But these are two photographs of the Mellon residence in New York, in Manhattan, around 2005. In 2006, she actually sold the house and released the works of art. And I think it's nice because it gives you a sense of what she liked, what she cherished, what she held onto, rather than releasing them after Paul's death, because she had complete control over the distribution, the posthumous distribution